Alright, today I'm back for another video in which we're going to be looking at Deleuze and Guattari's A Thousand Plateaus. In this lecture, we'll be looking at the seventh plateau, titled Year Zero, Faciality. This is a particularly interesting plateau. It can be difficult at times. Certainly there were easier plateaus that have come thus far, but this one is particularly interesting because I think it links up pretty well with modern gender theory and post-colonial studies, and generally the impetus that is driving them forward here is they're trying to figure out how exactly do binaries come about. And this might sound like a rather abstract question, but the point is that take stereotypes, for example. We have definite stereotypes of how one ought to be. If you are a man, it is a stereotype that you'll be particularly strong, and you'll be the sole provider for the household, and you'll do manual labor, things of this sort. Maybe you'll be bad at expressing your feelings or something like this. And if you are mentally ill, it is a stereotype that you will be unruly, no one will really want to talk to you. There will be these impediments to you being able to recover, even if you are mentally ill, because there are certain stereotypes surrounding mental illness that impede that person's ability to be integrated into society. And this is a big problem with retributive justice, generally speaking, which is that retributivism basically says that the best way to respond to crime is through punishment, whereas rehabilitative justice is going to look at the proper response as a form of rehabilitation and bringing this person back into society. And Deleuze and Guattari want to look at this impotence to penalize and to establish binaries, and they want to try to figure out, okay, how does this come about? And they talked about this a little bit before in the Geology of Morals, where they take a metaphor from geology, that of strata. And strata form in a geologic column. There are these horizontal layers of rock, and they deposit on each other over time through erosion and sedimentation and a couple other different environmental processes, which are going to create these layers which are defined by a certain consistency of rock, and then there is going to be a new strata. And if you look at a strata from the side, through like a cliff where it's open such that you can see it, you'll see these very definite strata. And they won't always just appear horizontally. Sometimes they will cut diagonally across strata. And Deleuze and Guattari look at society and they say, okay, there's all these kind of strata that are established that create a hierarchy. There are definite modes of being, of channels in which you are able to express yourself as child, as worker, as boss. And all of these are going to come with certain challenges, which is that you are essentially defined by a very narrow channel. And Deleuze and Guattari want to say, okay, we know that these binaries exist. For example, the male-female binary, the sane-insane, the civilized and savage. These are binaries which many modern philosophers have taken it upon themselves to deconstruct a little bit, in the sense that typically, these binaries are not innocently levied, but rather they serve the means of people who would like to usually privilege one term at the expense of the other. Jacques Derrida, the founder of deconstruction, in literary criticism and in philosophy, famously brings up this distinction between speech and writing to say that usually one is more preferred than the other at the detriment of the other. We can think of this as civilized and savage. This is not an innocent divide, but this is clearly one that has a lot of emotional baggage behind it, that is going to cause us to give justification to the way we treat these quote-unquote civilized, savage nations or people groups or ethnicities. And obviously, if you know anything about history, Hitler, Rwanda, wherever it may be, clearly this is going to result in an excuse of violence. And Deleuze and Guattari want to look at all these binaries, and they want to try to figure out what is this driving force that is creating them, and how exactly is it that all the multivariate ways in which people can express themselves, how is it that this is confined to definite channels? And not only this, because this is something that a lot of other philosophers have done, like Foucault, or Fanon, or Edward Said, and of course not all these necessarily occurring before or after Deleuze and Guattari. There's kind of a mix. But they specifically want to point not only to how we are restricted to these channels, but exactly how we can strategically break out of them. And that's an important part of the previous plateau, is that when they're talking about how to make yourself a body without organs, they essentially treat this as a model by which one can live on the edge, so to speak. How they can escape these boundaries and how they can do it through very definite subaltern strategies is what I call them. And these strategies are always methodical readings of the current time, the conditions, the material conditions, the ideological conditions, whatever it may be, without reducing the world to ideology or to class or whatever it may be. And they, in this plateau, spend a good bit of time talking specifically about the faciality of Christ. And we're going to talk exactly a little bit about what faciality is, but it's important to ruminate on the fact that this plateau opens with a picture of Christ appearing to two men in a boat. And obviously, this is a biblical story, and Jesus has a particular way in which he has affected societies. He has been the impetus for the genesis of one of the most important religions in the world, and the most adhered to religion of all the religions in the world. And it's important to see how this has resulted in the creation of order. It is certainly uncontroversial to say that Christianity and order are fairly at home in the same room with each other. There is a certain amount of structure that goes along with religion. And Jesus is obviously at the center of this structuration. So when Deleuze and Guattari talk about faces, they say that faces are not basically individual. They define zones of frequency or probability, delimit a field that neutralizes in advance any expressions or connections unnameable to the appropriate significations. And they also say the head, even the human head, is not necessarily a face. The face is produced only when the head ceases to be part of the body, when it ceases to be coded by the body, when it ceases to have a multidimensional, polyvocal, corporeal code, when the body, head included, has been decoded and has to be overcoded by something we shall call the face. And it's important to note that they use the capital F, face, there. So the face is not something strictly corporeal, but rather it is something that steps out of the corporeal material and comes to structure a field. And it delimits this field such that it establishes certain ways in which one can be in relation to this term, which is going to be defined by neutralizing certain forms of expression and connection. It is going to turn the variety of lines that one can draw and create a very definite picture which is going to define how exactly it is that one can live. They link the face to a sort of parasitism when they say the face depends on an abstract machine, that it is not content to cover the head, but touches all other parts of the body, and even, if necessary, other objects without resemblance. The question then becomes what circumstances trigger the machine that produces the face and facialization. So facialization is an active process. It's an active way in which key terms, key material happenings come to create a territory around themselves, come to establish themselves, and come to delimit a degree of dominance over the periphery in which they are situated within. And thus, the face is something which is going to delimit ways of being. And we could think of this literally, but it's important to note that they are not strictly taking the face literally. They, in their most abstract, talk about the face as the white wall black hole system. And essentially, this happens when we break down the face into its most elementary constituents. That the face is something like a white wall, this uniform surface with black holes in it. These are things like eyes, the nose, the mouth, maybe the ears if you want to say that's part of the face. It could be the pores of the skin. All of these are elements that occur on the kind of neutral backdrop of the face. And it's important to note that this backdrop is neutral at first. But when the face comes to establish itself, the face which is not articulated, those spots which are not the eyes or the mouth, come to take on a sort of negative character. They are that which does not control, or that which does not have a structuring effect. And thus, an important part of the face is essentially taking a zone which has a lot of variability and unlocalizability and making it localizable. The face takes this abstract part of the head and establishes it by certain key figures, such as the eyes and the mouth and the nose and the pores on the face and whatever it may be. And thus the face does have an important function. It establishes definite things that we can talk about. We can talk about eyes, we can talk about mouths, and we can link them to important functions that essentially relate the head to other things. And this is exactly what they mean, which they say when they're mentioning that the face depends on this abstract machine that does not just cover the head, but it touches peripherally other parts. The mouth has an interaction with the breast of the mother. The eyes have an interaction with light coming from outside. The ears have an interaction with varying intensities of pressure that create sound as they are processed through the ears and into the brain. But Deleuze and Guattari hint at a little bit of an issue with the face, precisely because it does a limiting function. Not only does it allow us to be able to situate the head as something definite, this is an important thing about seeing other people's faces, is that the face links an abstract quality like a feeling you get around someone or a voice, and it links it to something very corporeal and very unique to the individual. But when a face achieves a certain valence, and when it becomes sufficiently powerful enough, it starts to have a cancerous effect on the territory around it, such that other faces start to establish themselves in relation to the capital F face, the absolute face, that which totalizes the other faces, and that's what Deleuze and Guattari see a problem with. They say, to the point that if human beings have a destiny, it is rather to escape the face, to dismantle the face and facializations, to become imperceptible, to become clandestine, not by returning to animality, nor even by returning to the head, but by quite spiritual and special becomings animal, by strange, true becomings that get past the wall and get out of the black holes, that make faciality traits themselves finally elude the organization of the face. Freckles dashing toward the horizon, hair carried off by the wind, eyes you traverse instead of seeing yourself in or gazing into in those glum, face-to-face encounters between signifying subjectivities. I no longer look into the eyes of the woman I hold in my arms, but I swim through head and arms and legs, and I see that behind the sockets of the eyes there is a region unexplored, the world of futurity. And here there is no logic whatsoever. I have broken the wall. My eyes are useless, for they render back only the image of the known. My whole body must become a constant beam of light, moving with an ever greater rapidity, never arrested, never looking back, never dwindling. Therefore I close my ears, my eyes, my mouth. Body without organs. Yes, the face has a great future, but only if it is destroyed, dismantled. On the road to the asignifying and asubjective. But so far we have explained nothing of what we sense. So Deleuze and Guattari take a particularly revolutionary kernel out of this idea of order. And they say that, look, these ideas of faces are important. They situate us in a social relation to others. They situate us in channels in which we can express ourselves. The worker who is defined under the faciality of the king or the government or whatever it may be. This gives the worker a sense of home, a territory where they feel like they can express themselves in being the best worker they can be. Or the woman under the faciality of the man, capital M, man, can, in a sense, become the best woman they can be. You make me feel like a natural woman, as the song goes. But the problem is, and it's particularly easy to see in the latter example, is that what does it even mean to be a natural woman? It seems to be nothing other than something that has been established by the faciality of the man. Which is to say, by the ruling impetus of that term which starts to stand out, which starts to dominate, and which has this snowball effect of gathering territory around it and consuming it in a very cancerous way, such that now what was previously polyvocal and multiplicitous and in a sort of free-flowing mode of expression is reduced. And this is the problem, is that sometimes order is nice. Sometimes it's nice to be able to sit down knowing that you live in an ordered society and know that no one is going to bust into your home. But there are other times where it's not so nice to live in an ordered society. For example, when order becomes law and order. When it becomes an absolute entity in which the police start to levy forms of racially motivated violence or against certain gender minorities or against trans people, or when the government takes a particularly staunch stance against homeless people and says that it is now illegal for these people to sleep on the streets. This is not merely a method of action, but it is a cancerous mode of action which is defined by taking in different forms and subjugating them to a definite mode. And thus Deleuze and Guattari find it very pertinent to deconstruct this face and destroy the organization of the face. They use these very interesting examples of freckles that dash towards the horizon or hair that's carried off by the wind to say that the face is something malleable. And again, we need not take this exclusively literally, although I'm sure you could and it would be interesting. But the point is that these forms of order which are blanketed over us, like the government, or the family structure, or senses of civility. These are things which one can subtly mold. And they mention that to dismantle the face and become clandestine, one doesn't do this by returning to animality, which is to say that this would be equivalent to those who, in response to mass media, try to go back to pirate radio or something like that. They try to go back to some sort of grassroots mode of communication as an out that's going to escape the totalizing grasp of mass media. But Deleuze and Guattari, and I mean, they're not the only philosophers who think this. Jean Baudrillard does a very good job of levying this same criticism. But if our sole response to power is to run contra power, to negate power and go the opposite way, it seems that we are only internalizing that power, that we are only bending the knee to power and saying the only thing I can do, the only way in which I can act is by directly opposing you. And by opposing you in such a direct manner, I am showing your totalizing hold on me. And thus, a better strategy is not to return to this animality, to this pre-signifying time, to this pre-despotism. But rather, it's to become animal. Not to be animal, but to become animal. Which is to say that one embraces the fact, and they talk about this earlier, so forgive me if it sounds like it's a little bit out of context. But their point with becoming animal is that nature and just animals in general are going to be defined by an intense multiplicity, an intense variety, an intense varying response to stimuli. They are not necessarily going to be over-coded by social norms in the same way that humans will. And thus, for Deleuze and Guattari, they essentially want to take the idea of nomadism and this general refusal to be governed, and they want to take this to not a stupid limit, but a practical and pragmatic limit, where they say, okay, if we want to be able to express our agency, if we want to be able to have a voice, this has to be done by accepting the reign of the face in the sense of accepting the fact that it is there. And by not necessarily always going counter to the face, but rather engaging in this process where one looks at the way the face influences one and says, okay, I am going to enter on a journey of becoming, which is to say it's a mode of action which is defined by not having reached an absolute point, but rather the absolute intensity, so to speak, is the intensity of becoming. It is being engaged in a process that refuses to be sedentary and simple and normal. And thus, for them, they want to make these faciality traits elude the organization of the face. They want to take these elements, which are part of the structuring order which one has been placed within, and they want to make them bounce and fly and escape the function that they had been given. And thus, Deleuze and Guattari's emphasis, very similar to Nietzsche, they are going to be focused on things like cinema and art and contemporary music. They're focusing on these ways, even like poetry and literature too, and that is, we see that in their style, in their this very rapid and very chaotic way of writing. That they are essentially going to define themselves by taking these kernels they have been given and deterritorializing them absolutely, by refusing to have things be overcoded by the dominant face. And they had a quote there in the middle from Henry Miller, and he talks about breaking this wall and that his eyes are useless. And the important thing there is that at a certain point, one breaks out of these very simple understandings of normalcy or consciousness and gets to this point where we're not necessarily hiding behind something not being able to be explained, but rather we are standing by the fact that experiences cannot be reduced to the dominant face which seeks to facialize them and subdue them in an order. It's to say that when I'm in this person's arms, I swim through them. They prompt me to deterritorialize, to escape the territory in which I have been given and which has been imposed upon me, and to find me as such, and rather blaze my own path through this territory. Sometimes accepting this territory as a springboard, sometimes cutting through it in a very violent manner, but never in a manner where the face is ignored, but rather is always treated as an important element, which in a sense is giving one the reference necessary for, okay, where can I spring off of? Where can I go from here? I think it is important to notice the extent to which the face facializes other things. Deleuze and Guattari say even a use object may come to be facialized. You might say that a house, utensil, or object, an article of clothing, etc., is watching me. Not because it resembles a face, but because it is taken up in the white wall black hole process. Because it connects to the abstract machine of facialization. And their point here is that everything is involved in being structured by something else. That objects are defined in a relation to a dominant discourse. For example, a hammer does not exist on its own. This is similar to when Deleuze and Guattari say earlier, I think it was in the third or fourth, the postulates of linguistics, I believe the fourth plateau, that there are no individual statements, that there are only collective assemblages. When we look at the hammer, we necessarily, when we peer upon it, see it as a hammer which brings to mind certain functions, ways in which it ought to be used, ways in which it is used, and which necessarily links to other terms which are equiprimordially presupposed, to use some Heideggerian language. Which is to say, they are presupposed at the same level. That to think of the hammer is necessarily to invoke the nail. and construction as a business, and the industrial apparatus that creates hammers and nails, and an artisan to use that hammer and those nails. So there is a whole field that in fact is in reciprocal presupposition. That's the word that, or a phrase that Deleuze and Guattari like to use, with the product that we like to think, or the object that we like to think exists on its own. And thus, everything is related to a face in some way. Everything is related to some form of dominance. Very simple objects will nevertheless be altered in the way we perceive them by, for example, advertising, which is going to subliminally impose upon us little ways in which it is assumed that something ought to be used. Little ways in which we ought to change our behavior or the way in which we interact with others, such that we are irrevocably linked to the face, and so are very simple objects, which come together to create a form of social ontology, a way of looking at things philosophically where we refuse to imagine that things exist on their own. For example, gender does not exist on its own. Gender exists within a milieu of constructed ideas of virtue, of proper methods of action, of stereotypes, and of burdens placed upon these two different groups which have been created, often of which the burden is not all that equal. And thus we can see the cynicism behind this idea of faciality that is going to cause Deleuze and Guattari to be so reticent to take the face at face value, so to speak. An important part of contemporary continental philosophy and critical theory and postmodernism, these are all kind of interlacing terms, is that they take the time to look at cultural practices that were deemed savage or uncivilized, and they want to look at the ways in which maybe these were excised for a reason. Not to say that reason is valid, but to point out that in fact it serves some faces to pretend like others don't exist. When talking about different tribes, they say paintings, tattoos, or marks on the skin embrace the multidimensionality of bodies. Even masks ensure the head's belonging to the body rather than making it a face. Doubtless, there are profound movements of deterritorialization that shake up the coordinates of the body and outline particular assemblages of power. However, they connect the body not to faciality, but to becoming's animal, in particular with the help of drugs. Of course, there is no less spirituality for that, for these becoming's animal involve an animal spirit, a jaguar spirit, bird spirit, ocelot spirit, toucan spirit, that takes possession of the body's interior, enters its cavities, and fills its volumes instead of making a face for it. Possession expresses a direct relation between voices and the body, rather than a relation to the face. Shaman, warrior, and hunter organizations of power, fragile and precarious, are all the more spiritual by virtue of the fact that they operate through corporeality, animality, and vegetality. When we said earlier that the human head still belongs to the stratum of the organism, we obviously were not denying the existence of culture and societies among these peoples. We were merely saying that these cultures and societies as codes pertain to bodies, to the belonging of heads to bodies, to the ability of the body-head system to become and receive souls and to perceive them as friends while repulsing enemy souls. quote-unquote primitives may have the most human of heads, the most beautiful and most spiritual, but they have no face and need none. So here, they're pointing out an important element which is often overlooked, and it's common when we talk about masks. It is typically said that a mask is attempting to cover up the true face behind. But it is ignored that in many of these tribal cultures, the purpose of the mask is not to become someone else, but to enter oneself into a becoming in which there is a connection with ancestors, with the earth itself, with the animals around. It is a becoming animal in which one actually effectuates one's self, in which one's self becomes changed through the process of engaging with the world through the mask. So the mask is not so much a limit between the true self and the spiritual world, but rather it is a connection in which the self undergoes a becoming, in which the mask has a veritable effect on the quote-unquote true face behind the mask. And when we see these tribes in the way they interact, it's very patronizing to assume that, oh, they're just playing pretend. They know this is all wrong, and they're just doing this because mommy and daddy told them to. Now, maybe that's the case. Of course, practices are carried down through tradition. But the important part is that these masks were not done or not donned in an attempt to restore some sort of order, but rather to become transhuman, to enter into a line of flight in which one makes a profound contact across that white wall, so to speak, punctures that white wall, makes that white wall rather obsolete, by themselves engaging in a process in which the body is shot through the very interior, in which it fills the volumes of the person, not with a particularly definable affect, but rather, it's an almost indescribable kind of thing. This is a very interesting thing to talk about in the anthropology of religion. But the important thing to note is that it is not about establishing an order, but entering into a dance with disorder. It is about fracturing these locuses of power by virtue of the fact that it is not an escape into the spiritual dimension, but it is a process of becoming spiritual, becoming animal, becoming that mask through a process. And Deleuze and Guattari find this appealing because we like to assume that we can reduce this idea of wearing a mask to an attempt to cover up what's really underneath. I think this is often invoked when guys talk about makeup, for example. They say that I'm not even really sure who I'm speaking of when I say they, but it is an unfortunate incel stereotype that is spread of women, that only ugly women wear makeup, that makeup is a sort of mask to hide the ugliness beneath, to change oneself and pretend that what one is not. But in actuality, if you talk to someone who wears makeup, sure, they may have some insecurities, but they equally wear that makeup as an extension of a mode of expression that merely may not have been able to be facilitated without makeup. So it is not a question of becoming reliant on makeup to establish oneself, but rather to realize oneself through a process. Makeup is an intensive process. All this time and meticulous thought that goes behind putting on makeup, it is a transformative process that gets one in touch with oneself by learning how to effectuate the face. It is about changing the face in a way that is a mode of expression. This is a wonderfully literal way in which faciality can be altered, in which we can have a veritable effect on the face, just like the paintings and tattoos and marks on the skin. They're embracing the multidimensionality of expression. That expression cannot be reduced to the true man or the true woman or the true boss. Instead, these modes of expression should be about expressing the multidimensionality of bodies, the uniqueness of each body, not about making it bend in reference to some dominant face. This all becomes connected to Jesus in an interesting way, which is going to connect us to a particular binary in the way that things are expressed in structures, which is going to allow for both order and newness in the same ontological framework. It's going to allow for the possibility that creativity will be stifled, and also that it may be able to be expressed in the right circumstances. And they talk about this throughout when they talk about having a territory and how territories are always encapsulated by these rough edges of deterritorialization. These edge cases which show the territory to be rather something fleeting, and something which is engaged in a process of becoming. And they mention that any deterritorialization is always going to be accompanied by a reterritorialization on another body without organs. And this is a lot of jargon, I know. But the point is that any change, any revolutionary change, any moment of alternating valence is going to be accompanied by a new territory and a new order being established. And thus there is a fine line within the mind of the revolutionary who is going to accept their responsibility as a musician, as a painter, as a poet, as a literary critic, as a philosopher, to draw this line of flight carefully, such that it is able to find new ways of acting that are not themselves going to recoil too much into dominant faces. And they mention that this is precisely what happened in the Bolshevik Revolution. That in Russia in 1917, and a little bit in 1914 too, but primarily in 1917, that the Bolshevik Revolution was rallied around workers and things like this. But, of course, after the Bolshevik Revolution, it laid barren territory which could be seized by oligarchs and used as a new form of despotic territory. And thus, their treatment of Jesus is particularly interesting because it does show the very precarious relationship between order and creativity. They say, Jesus Christ superstar. He invented the facialization of the entire body and spread it everywhere. the Passion of Joan of Arc in close-up. Thus, the face is by nature an entirely specific idea, which did not preclude its acquiring and exercising the most general of functions, the function of bi-univocalization, or binarization. It has two aspects. The abstract machine of faciality, insofar as it is composed by a black hole white wall system, functions in two ways, one of which concerns the units or elements, the other the choices. Under the first aspect, the black hole acts as a central computer, Christ, the third eye that moves across the wall or the white screen, serving as a general surface of reference. Regardless of the content one gives it, the machine constitutes a facial unit, an elementary face in bi-univocal relation with another. It is a man or a woman, a rich person or a poor one, an adult or a child, a leader or a subject, an X or a Y. The movement of the black hole across the screen, the trajectory of the third eye over the surface of reference, constitutes so many dichotomies or arborescences, like four-eyed machines made of elementary faces linked together two by two. The face of a teacher and a student, father and son, worker and boss, cop and citizen, accused and judged. The judge had a stern expression. His eyes were horizonless. Concrete, individualized faces are produced and transformed on the basis of these units, these combinations of units. Like the face of a rich child in which a military calling is already discernible, that West Point chin. You don't so much have a face as slide into one. So their point here is that the face's primary function is binarization, or bi-univocalization, as they say. Which is to say that the face is essentially going to be tasked with creating binaries. Like they say, man or woman, rich or poor, adult or child, leader or subject. And this obviously is a problem when we consider what is it to be man or woman? Who or what is deciding this? And Deleuze and Guattari's answer is the face. And they are particularly picking on Jesus here to say that his face has had such dominance. And his face is, of course, not literally only his face, but also his influence, more broadly. That he has acted as this third eye, this general surface of reference. Think about the way in which, in Christianity, the question is commonly asked, WWJD, what would Jesus do? Jesus' character, his face, is the background upon which decisions are instantiated. Is it virtuous? Is it not virtuous? This binary is defined by Jesus. What is masculine? What is feminine? It's defined by Jesus. Right or wrong? Defined by Jesus. And so on. And even the way in which we treat the poor or treat those who think differently than us. In the Christian paradigm, Jesus is this person. It is Jesus Christ superstar as the capital F face. And thus, Jesus' face, as they say, is an elementary face in bi-univocal relation with another. Which is to say, the face of Jesus is naturally going to lend to relate itself to other faces. But it's not going to be an equal presupposition or an equal relationship, but it's going to be one in which Jesus' face is the transcendent face, the point of reference, and the other is going to assume the lesser role, the reference, so to speak, which gives Jesus' face its power. It's going to serve as a relatively limp subject, which is going to allow Jesus' face to proliferate, to new people, to allow the message to spread, so to speak. And thus, faces are imposed. That's an important thing that they say when they say you don't so much have a face as slide into one. It is not merely an innocent process of being a man, of being a woman, of being a boss, of being a worker, of being a child. It is in fact a role in which one almost flies into, or is sat down into like a rocking chair. I mean, think of this. One doesn't decide to be a child, or what that means, how you ought to relate to your parents. This is something which you are instilled from a young age, that you ought to act such and such a way to your parents. You ought to honor thy father and mother, as the Bible says. And thus, tradition is a form of order which Deleuze and Guattari, like they've shown with tribal practices, tradition can be a method that is going to enter a community into a becoming animal together. But it is also going to act as a subterranean force that is going to constrain and dictate and calm the waters of a sea that is teeming with creative possibility. And thus, their criticism of typical binaries like man or woman, or adult or child, or rich or poor, is that it is founded upon an unequal postulating of both of these faces. The dominant face gets to decide what the non-dominant face is going to be. The face of Christ is going to decide how you get to act, how you get to express yourself, how you get to choose your career and things like this. And thus we can clearly see Deleuze and Guattari's problem with order, which often is quite confusing to many. They continue, under the second aspect, the abstract machine of faciality assumes a role of selective response, or choice. Given a concrete face, the machine judges whether it passes or not, whether it goes or not, on the basis of the elementary facial units. This time the binary relation is one of the yes-no type. The empty eye or black hole absorbs or rejects, like a half-doddering despot who can still give a signal of acquiescence or refusal. So they place the face in a particularly interesting situation in which they admit that it is half-doddering. It is this despotic strategy by which tradition is selectively decided. But not only that, but it's a little bit of an unstable order. They want to point out that these facial systems, so to speak, in which there's a dominant face and there's these elementary facial units like the eyes, which are going to establish definite relations with other things, that this is a bit of a teeter-tottering regime. And it's almost like a grate on the road. And this metal grate is going to allow water and small stones to pass through it, but not things like boulders or the wheels of cars. This matrix is acting similar to the face. It is establishing what allows to pass through. It displays the selective permeability of a cell membrane, of allowing certain things to pass and certain things to not. And thus, with the example of cellular biology, we see that with the selective permeability of a cell membrane, allows for a larger organism to develop, allows for lots of organs to be pulled in and turned into an organism, organized in a way which is going to allow for certain dominant forms to get proliferated. So we can see it's fairly connected to natural science. So Deleuze and Guattari's point here is that the dominant face is not merely an innocent face, but one which absorbs and rejects. And absorbs is important. That which the face needs, it absorbs under its regime. Think of all the Christian wars. Think of the Crusades. Think of the Protestant and Catholic conflicts in Ireland. Think of the Spanish Inquisition. These were all ways in which the dominant face of Christ, of the mission of Christianity, was levied as an excuse to absorb these minor faces. These faces which did not quite fit with what was familiar. And thus, the rule of the face is not an innocent one, but one which thrives on a parasitism of that which is not the dominant face. And if it cannot absorb it, it rejects it. That which cannot be totalized by the face becomes mad, sick, sinful, ugly, unrighteous. Thus, the Christian's relation to the non-Christian becomes one in which it is said that those who deny the truth suppress the truth in their unrighteousness. The rejection of those which view differently, which refuse to acquiesce to the dominant face, become evil, conniving, purposely disobeying what they know to be the truth. And thus, this is not a very nice binary to be in. It is going to be established by something that is going to determine a very warlike tendency will continue to come back. Because always there will be this sectarianism between the face and that which precludes the face. That which steps beyond the face or cannot be accounted for by the dominant face of Christ, for example. Now, Deleuze and Guattari are not naive. You can call Deleuze and Guattari a lot of things, but if you read A Thousand Plateaus, it is very difficult to say that they are naive. Because they point out that it's not so simple as absorption or rejection. But there's this crucial middle point where things cannot be absorbed, but they're also not rejected. They're in this liminal space where they are treated in a particular way. They say, at every moment, the machine rejects faces that do not conform or seem suspicious, but only at a given level of choice. For it is necessary to produce successive divergence types of deviance for everything that eludes biunivocal relationships, and to establish binary relationships between what is accepted on first choice and what is only tolerated on second, third choice, etc. So, deviance becomes an important element of the regime of the face, so to speak. That it is not merely a question of will you be absorbed by the face or will you be rejected by the face, but rather part of the terms which may be rejected by the face or cannot be accounted for by the face become deviant. They become mad, and they become this linking term which allows the dominant face, like the face of Christ, to have a relationship to that which is refusing to be governed by the face. Oh, you're simply mad, Or you simply just haven't learned yet. You haven't seen the truth yet in a very patronizing way like that, which is going to stimulate things like missionary work, in which people go to societies that are viewed in a very patronizing way and are treated as merely not having searched for the truth yet, or something like this, in a way in which that which is not yet Christian is not just rejected, but it is treated as deviant. It is treated with an air of caution, but also with a sense of awe and salivation at that which could be absorbed by the face of Christ. I think it's particularly interesting to see the way in which Deleuze and Guattari end where we're going to end here, which is in connecting this idea of faciality to racism. Because race we don't like to think of it as a binary, but the way in which race is levied as a category, it in fact is a binary. It is almost always levied as white as the perfect race, and everything else as subhuman. Not non-human, but subhuman. Deleuze and Guattari say, if the face is in fact Christ, in other words, your average ordinary white man, then the first deviances, the first divergence types are racial. Yellow man, black man, men in the second or third category. They are also inscribed on the wall, distributed by the whole. They must be Christianized, in other words, facialized. European racism, as the white man's claim, has never operated by exclusion or by the designation of something as other. It is instead in primitive societies that the stranger is grasped as an other. Racism operates by the determination of degrees of deviance in relation to the white man face, which endeavors to integrate nonconforming traits into increasingly eccentric and backward waves, sometimes tolerating them at given places under given conditions, in a given ghetto, sometimes erasing them from the wall, which never abides alterity. It's a Jew, it's an Arab, it's a Negro, it's a lunatic. From the viewpoint of racism, there is no exterior. There are no people on the outside. There are only people who should be like us and whose crime it is not to be. The dividing line is not between inside and outside, but rather is internal to simultaneous signifying chains and successive subjective choices. Racism never detects the particles of the other. It propagates waves of sameness until those who resist identification have been wiped out, or those who only allow themselves to be identified at a given degree of divergence. Its cruelty is equaled only by its incompetence and its naivete. And I absolutely love this because it touches on some of the stuff we've already talked about. That the face of Christ is, in a sense, also facialized as the white man, right? Obviously, Jesus was not white. Everyone knows that. And I get so much flack for this. I posted this particular quote on one of my social medias, and I got a lot of responses from some Christian acquaintances who were like, Jesus wasn't white. I'm like, yes, Deleuze and Guattari know that. The whole point is that the face of Christ itself is a rather empty term. Christ's face itself, he slips into his own face. And who decides that face? Those who are purposely weaponizing the figure of Christ in order to serve their means. Now, this is not to absolve Christ. There is plenty of explicitly bad things which were not merely imposed upon or read into Christianity, but were explicitly there. Not merely latently, but in a very exterior way. But the point is that the face of Christ is itself something which he slides into, and which is used to define what deviancy is. The yellow man, the black man, all of these other types, and they must now be Christianized. This is that incompetence and naivete which is undergirding this, that it's merely this bombastic trotting into enemy territory, so to speak. And there's all sorts of funny stories about how unorganized the Crusades were sometimes, but equally how brutal they were. And the point is that the face of Christ is itself something that facializes, which is going to necessarily proliferate out. And it's not merely going to be content with defining the other as something that gets to exist happily over there, but as something who, as they say, the crime is not to acquiesce. That it is a crime to not be like one of us, and that you must be exterminated. That, oh, it's a Jew. And that utterance is not merely an innocent utterance. It is one which compels a racist attitude to become offensive against, and I should say offensive, I should clarify my pronunciation. It becomes offensive against that group, which is merely just pointed out. Because it's not just a question of innocent designation, but rather it's one in which something is localized and seeked out like a heat-seeking missile seeks to destroy. And in this way, racism is determining degrees of deviance. It's not necessarily laying claim to an absolute binary between this is white and this is not. This is human and this is non-human. But rather, this is human and this is subhuman. And it is a crime, it is dirty for them to be the way they are, but we can fix them and we should go in and Christianize them. And thus, there's not merely this dividing line between the inside and outside, but there's this precarious case in which those who are others, those who present alterity, are in this mysterious double bind in which they serve as an outside territory of the dominant face, and in which they are also a necessary part of the dominant face's existence, as something which compels the dominant face to come out of itself and to create both the order and the divergence which defines what that order is. So I hope this has given you some interesting musings, and maybe you'll read part of 1,000 Plateaus if you're interested. As always, leave questions in the comments and any constructive criticism you may have, and I'll see you in another lecture.